Welcome to the Tabula Poetica Poetry Reading Series. After today with visiting poet Allison Joseph over here. After today we have one remaining poetry event this fall. The series concludes with a reading by our own Chapman University MFA students on November 30th at 5 p.m. in the Malloy Performance Portico. You can find more details on our website and our Facebook group page. Before we begin, please make sure your cell phone is turned off. Barnes & Noble will have books by all this year's Tabula Poetica visiting poets available for purchase at the reading later this evening, and we'll have time for book signing both after this talk and then after the reading. I want to acknowledge poets and writers, which through the James Irvine Foundation contributed grants to support each writer's visit this fall. I want to thank the Department of English for tremendous support of all kinds for Tabula Poetica. In particular, thank you to Patrick Quinn, Patrick Fury, Logan Esdale, Jim Blaylock, Lacey Walswick, Jennifer Klunk, Laura Silva, Natalie Dave, who's here. She's my graduate assistant for Tabula Poetica. Yeah, give Natalie a hand. And my colleagues in English and also in other departments who've cheered on this growing project. We are also grateful to Dean Charlene Baldwin, Admin Lori Gates, and Leatherby Libraries for hosting all the readings. Allison's reading will be at 5 p.m. today in the Henley Room. Thanks as well to the visiting poets past and present, who without exception have been affable and insightful. These poets bring wide-ranging voices and aesthetics into the conversation that Tabula Poetica is designed to foster. I first met some of them when they showed up for their visit, and I'm glad to know them all now. On to Allison Joseph. I knew Allison Joseph before she flew in yesterday from her home in Carbondale, Illinois, where she directs the MFA program at Southern Illinois University. I wanted Allison to join us at Chapman University because I've seen her talk about poetry with students before. She's enthusiastic, and she thoroughly enjoys working with all sorts of poets. In fact, she is the director of the Young Writers Workshop, a summer program for high school students. One of the other generous things Allison does for the poetry world is the Creative Writers Opportunities List. This is a listserv available to writers free of charge that contains postings about contests, calls for writing, and jobs for writers. If you haven't seen the Creative Writers Opportunities List, Google that and get signed up for updates, or you can check it, but they'll send you updates. Of course, she's published numerous poetry collections too. What Keeps Us Here won the Ampersand Press Women Poets Series Prize and the Zacharias Prize from Plowshares and Emerson College. Her more recent collection, My Father's Kites, was published this year by Steel Toe Books, and that's the one my students have been reading this semester. The opening poem of that collection includes a series of questions that seem an invitation to variety in poetry and among poets, something Tabula Poetica strives to nourish. In that opening poem called Bio Note, the poet may live on 3 acres with 2 kids that inspire all she does, or the poet may live urban and alone with 2 cats. Here, Allison Joseph is not writing about herself. She writes about the many shapes a poet's life may take and the many aesthetics available to poets. Yet I surmise that today's visit will reveal that, as this poem suggests, she angers all the right angels, misbehaves in the nicest way, makes wondrous the quotidian. The collection concludes with the following line in A Daughter's Villanelle. All I can do is write, because I can. Let us celebrate Allison's writing today and also be encouraged by her to write our own poems and prose. This afternoon's talk is called Dispatches from a Poetry Editor. Allison speaks from experience as the poetry editor of Crab Orchard Review. Please welcome the smart, funny, gracious poet Allison Joseph.
And I want to thank my friend Anna Leahy we've been planning this visit for, it seems, ever, and it's not easy to get a poet from Southern Illinois to Southern California. I've been traveling a lot lately, and it's not easy to get from where I live, which is 335 miles south of Chicago. Well, it's not easy to get from there to anywhere. So thank you again for having me, thanks to the English department in particular and the creative writing program. I'm going to talk a little bit about the changes I see in literary publishing. And by literary publishing, I don't mean the annual blockbuster that everybody buys one copy of and then no one actually reads. I'm talking about poetry, serious literary fiction, and creative nonfiction. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the directions I see. This talk will be of particular interest if you are a writer and you are encountering new and perhaps unfamiliar ways of disseminating your work into the world. And to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about my background as an editor, my background as a writer, but specifically what I do day to day as a poetry editor still, and why I cling to the old ways with a ferocity that sometimes scares me. I started as a graduate student on Indiana Review, which is still going strong. It's a national literary journal that publishes poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, edited by graduate students at Indiana University, where I received my MFA. I think it's really interesting and worthwhile for both graduate and undergraduate students to have the experience of working on a literary journal. It makes you look at your own work slightly differently. Instead of, when you're reading work by unfamiliar strangers, when you're reading work that comes to you unbidden, and you don't know anything about who Karen Anway Lee is, and you read a poem of hers. I'm going to embarrass you, Karen. You read a poem of hers, and you say, who is this Karen Anway Lee? I haven't heard of her. I had the opportunity to publish some of Karen's poems at the very beginning of her career, and that's one of the really satisfying things about being a literary editor, to discover people and to say, I'm going to put this out into the world and make sure other people read it. So I began as a graduate student, and if you have the opportunity as an undergraduate or a graduate student to select work for publication, it really is a good part of your education. It also lets you know what poems you don't need to write. I saw a lot of poems as a graduate student. I'm just staying away from that. Let other people conquer that topic or do that territory. It helped me define who I wanted to be as a poet by knowing what other people were doing. People who had no relationship to me. They weren't in workshop with me. I wasn't seeing their work on a regular basis other than submissions that were coming over the transom. When my husband, John Tribble, and I moved from Little Rock, his hometown, to Carbondale, Illinois, we were confronted with, and this happens very rarely, an English department that wanted to start a new literary journal. We started Crab Orchard Review 15 years ago. We just recently did our 15th anniversary issue. We started the journal 15 years ago. And one of the reasons that we started the journal is that my chair at the time, a gentleman named Richard Peterson, a small man from Pittsburgh, and you don't know Tenacious until you've met a small man from Pittsburgh. There's something about people from Pittsburgh, they just want it done. He said to us, when I was hired, and John came with me, and in a coincidence we were unaware of, our friend Carolyn Alessio was also hired to teach fiction. All of us had experience on literary journals. He said, I want you to start a journal. And John, being the wise person that he is, said, I will not start a journal unless we can actually pay people. We both have this bug about writers being paid for what it is they create. Writers can be generous to the point of being too generous to give away their work. And for a long time, there was a tradition of you publish a poem or a story or an essay in a journal and you get copies as payment. Well, copies are nice, but they don't pay your rent and they don't allow you to go take someone out for dinner or buy a pair of new shoes if you want a pair of new shoes. And we all need new shoes, don't we? So we insisted from the very beginning that people get paid for their work. Whether their work was poetry, fiction, nonfiction, it's all work. People tend to think of the job of a writer as being sort of airy-fairy and out there, and oh, inspiration just strikes, and the muse takes over. That's only the first half of it. Then you've got to, kick the muse's ass and write draft after draft and shape your work into something that is presentable and something that you want to represent you out in the world. So with that in place, with the knowledge that, yes, we were going to start on this new adventure, we started getting work for a very first issue. And the reason I tell you that my former chair, Richard Peterson, was a tenacious man from Pittsburgh was as soon as he got us all in place as various editors, John was going to be managing editor, a position he holds to this day. I was going to be poetry editor, and Carolyn was going to be prose editor, and he was going to be editor-in-chief. As soon as he set up a staff and then went back to the people who had originally promised funding in the university, when it seemed like there was going to be an actual magazine, they all bailed. We went on ahead. He asked all the people who had grudges against those people to make contributions so that first issue could exist. So we published the first issue. A second issue came along out of similar strange circumstances. One of our strengths as a department in Carbondale is Irish Studies. And the American Conference for Irish Studies was actually coming to Carbondale. And one of my colleagues at the time, who was director of our Irish Studies program, said, if you'll do a special thematic issue of Crab Orchard Review and get it done in time for the conference, I'll pay the printing costs. And I said, Erin, go bragh. So we did a special issue on Irish and Irish-American writing that we have established this tradition at Crab Orchard Review. If you're familiar with the journal at all, we do one general issue and then we do one thematic issue, and we've done all sorts of themes, and that's a way of editors, as editors, of remaining interested in the process of editing. In fact, we just did an issue on, since it was our 15th anniversary issue and we are based in the state of Illinois, we did an issue on the state of Illinois, and Anna Leahy has work in that issue. So we had 2 issues and no budget line, and we happened to be fortunate enough that the president of the university at the time was retiring, and he decided to fund us. He decided, sometimes administrators get very jealous, not jealous, they get very generous, excuse me. That was quite a Freudian slip. They get very generous on the way out, and they decide that like presidents, they're going to leave a legacy, so we were part of the legacy of a gentleman named John Guyon, and we've continued publishing for this period of 15 years. In this period of 15 years, the changes I've seen have been dramatic. When we started, pretty much everyone who was starting a journal started it in print form. Nowadays, when people start new journals, they're generally online, and there are a lot of advantages to being an online journal. At 2:30 in the morning, when I'm stuffing envelopes and we're slapping labels on to do a mailing, I'm really wishing that we were an online journal, and that may be part of our future. But when we started, pretty much new journals were print journals, and I have a huge affection for print. Yes, I am a tree killer. I love books. I love new books. I love old books. I love magazines. My house is very messy because sometimes I don't even throw out the Us magazine that comes. And that, that really does need to be thrown out. So when I say cling to the old ways, it means that we are committed for as long as we possibly can to be a print journal, something that you get in the mail, something that is about 250 pages, so it's got heft, it's got weight. You can read it in one sitting, or you can take it with you on the train or on the plane and read it at your leisure. And for me, the act of reading is something that's continuous, that when I read something on a screen, I click on the link, I tend to look at it once, and I don't know, this just happens to be my own reading habits. I tend to click on it, read it, and leave it. And that's just my predilection. But I do understand the blossoming of literary journals on the web. There are so many things that you can accomplish with a web journal that it's hard to accomplish with merely a print version. And we do have a website, but basically it's an informational website. We haven't reprinted any issues simply for the web. It's something that we've talked about, but we haven't done it. For me, print is still preferred, but as a writer myself, I've had the experience of having work presented in web journals that never saw print at all. And for me, I can't say that it's disappointing, because I know that people who are starting web journals are just as sincere and just as committed as people who do print journals. But for me, it's that my interaction with the screen isn't as profound as it is with an actual book, an actual text. I can see the shift, the generational shift, though, occurring with my graduate students. My MFA students, particularly my fiction writers, and I can say, yes, they are mine, are publishing with frequency and ferocity in web journals, particularly the form that seems to fit the web very well. Flash fiction, microfiction, 100-word stories, whatever you want to call it. That form, a story that occupies probably one web page, seems to be, and this perhaps is because a lot of my students are younger, they're new to the game, they want gratification that's much more instant. Back in the old days, you submitted a manuscript, printed it up, put it in the envelope, and there are still many places that do it this way. You print it up, put it in the envelope, add your SASE, your self-addressed stamped envelope, and you wait. We were talking about this earlier in Anna's beginning class. And usually it was a period of maybe 2 to 3 months. Usually there was a sort of tacit agreement that you waited 2 to 3 months before you sent that angry letter saying, "Where's my work? What's the decision on my work?" With the web, everything's been accelerated. That traditional method of putting the manuscript together, including the cover letter, putting the SASE, that still holds true where I work. But a lot of places, even print journals, have moved to submission managers on the web, which means you go to the website for the magazine, there'll be some sort of portal there. Frequently, it's a site called Submishmash. There'll be some sort of portal there. You upload your work. You wait a day or two. You come back to the site, and you can see whether it's been accepted or rejected by checking the portal. That means you don't have that 2 to 3 month window of waiting, trotting down to the mailbox, opening it up, seeing if there's something in there, seeing if you got your SASE back, opening up your SASE, seeing the little slip of paper that says, "Thank you for your submission to, we regret that it does not suit our needs at this time." One thing I vowed as an editor, that I would never send people that little slip of paper that says, "We regret that this does not suit our needs at this time." So I have never, in 15 years of editing Crab Orchard Review, not sent somebody a letter with at least their name and address on it. And it takes It does take considerably more time to do it that way, but I do want to acknowledge that I know that there's an actual person on the other end who sent me this story, or sent me this group of poems, or sent me this essay. I may be clinging tenaciously to the old ways, but it always felt better to get an actual letter when I was getting my work back, as opposed to a little slip of paper that said, "We regret," and I never use that sentence, "We regret that this does not suit our needs at this time," which you know is a load of BS, because it doesn't suit their needs at this time or any time in the future. It's just a euphemism for saying, we're not going to publish you. I've tried steadfastly throughout my career as an editor to never use that sentence. So you've got the traditional method of the SASE, you've got the submitting online, and then some places just give you an email address and you send your work. That to me is the most problematic, because we all know that emails go astray, that they disappear, and if you're a poet, you're probably very concerned about the formatting of your work. And it's very difficult to format a poem on one end that will look exactly the same when someone, even if you do an attachment, God knows what the other person is using on the other end. But I am happy that web journals, print journals, and those that are hybrids seem to be all coexist pretty peacefully. That small press, and they used to call in the Writer's Market book, they used to call this category literary and little, meaning magazines with circulations that weren't mass market circulations, but probably Crab Orchard Review, being a well-established journal that it is, our circulation is still only about 3,000 people, which is huge for a literary journal. The advantage a journal on the web supposedly has is that anyone can access it. Anyone can go to a journal that is primarily on the web and read the work there. Whether people actually do is a whole other issue. I myself still spend the majority of my time as a reader of other literary journals, reading traditional print journals. But here's something else to add to the mix. Several long-running, very familiar, if you follow literary journals, very familiar journals have made the move from being traditional print journals to being web journals. Two very recent examples: Tri-Quarterly, which was published for many years by Northwestern University, and Shenandoah, which is another really storied, long-running literary journal published by Washington and Lee University in Virginia, have both recently made the decision to move from being traditional print journals to being online presences only. And in the case of Tri-Quarterly, from what I've heard, it wasn't necessarily because they were anti-print. What I've heard is some university politics had to do with that. I don't work at Northwestern, so I can't give you the skinny, but I've heard. Whether people will still have the same reverence and respect for Tri-Quarterly and Shenandoah now that they're simply online presences, I'm not sure. One of the reasons I continue to hope that we will be a print presence is that people tend to devalue, whether they should or shouldn't, things that occur on the web. They tend to say, oh, you have a web journal. Oh, okay. How much work do you print everything you get, or do you publish everything you get? There's a sort of, maybe this is just my perception, but since the web is a wild frontier, a free-for-all, and anyone can start a magazine, does that mean all magazines that are on the web are bad? Not necessarily. There were a lot of bad print magazines as well. there was the whole, and I kind of miss these days. I'm nostalgic for well, I'm not nostalgic for plaid, but I'm nostalgic for the zine scene where people had 250 copies of something stapled that may have come out, well, whenever the editor felt like it. And they went to their local copy shop and did 250 copies. And I seem to remember that from the days of Kurt Cobain and everybody being miserable and wearing plaid a lot. But those days seem to be gone because a lot of those inspirations have moved onto the web as well. I don't want to sound like I'm a grouchy old woman and saying print is best, print is best. But I do worry about certain things. The ephemeral nature of the web, that we constantly demand that it be new every day. And, you know, if the home page at Yahoo for some reason wasn't changed, well, it seems like every 15 minutes it changed, but if a day went by and it wasn't changed, we would all be up in arms. It's like, it's the same thing it was yesterday. But the impulse that makes us write poems and stories and essays is an impulse that's the long-range impulse. One of the tests of, is this good or not, is how long has this been around? This Flannery O'Connor woman, you know, how long has she been writing? When's she going to come out with something new? Well, we know she's not. At least we think she's not going to come out with something new. So there's the opportunity to look back and see, yes, something that endures, something that's touched us for a while. And it's hard, I think, for the web to capture that. And I may be indulging a romantic notion here, that literature is enduring and somewhat universal, and that we all want to reach for it, reach back for it, even as we're looking for the new hot writer and the new person who's going to come along, the next Sadie Smith, for example. So those are some of my thoughts on the topic. I'm really trapped between a bunch of books in a hard place, let's put it that way. One of the reasons that we are increasingly frustrated as a print journal is, and I'm going to sound seditious and anti-government and a little paranoid, but the post office literally sucks. We do these bulk mailings of about 3,000 copies. We break it up, but we follow all the rules. And if you've ever had the unhappy experience of doing a bulk mailing, there are Byzantine rules, and you have to follow the postal codes and do things just right, and then the rules change. I'm very fortunate that John, in addition to being a splendid person and my husband, has sort of memorized these rules and coded them into our computer programming so we can generate labels that at 2:30 in the morning we're sticking on envelopes. But it is disheartening when you send the magazine out into the world and the post office sends you something back. Of course we know people move and things are going to come back, but when it looks like somebody's dog got to it, even though you put it in the bag that the post office told you to put it in, and so some of those issues keep coming back to haunt us, and just how expensive it is to bulk mail anything. It's really freaking expensive. It's terribly expensive, and it goes up every time we send the magazine out. So it would be much easier for us to just move the whole thing onto the web. One compromise I've seen some journals do, I had the honor of being the featured poet for a journal called Reverie. Reverie is an African-American journal, Midwest African-American literature, and this made me feel glad and old at the same time, because I was the first recipient of the Aquarius Press Legacy Award. And what that award was for a African American writer who has helped others along. And when they give you the legacy award, you kind of feel like, okay, am I done? Do I go do I go sit down in the corner now and be quiet? But it was very nice. I went to an award ceremony. Yeah, it was in Detroit, but hey, I have affection for Detroit. I'm from the Bronx. I can't talk. And one of the things they use to disseminate the issue is a site called Issue, ISUUU.com. I think that's the URL. And what it does is you go to Issue, you click on a link, and there will be the text of a magazine, and you can flip through the magazine pages. There are several of these sites where the actual text of a magazine will be there, and you can flip through it on your screen. And if you want to, the site will generate the actual book for you. You can order a printed copy. So that might be more of a direction I see us going to, that we do our print runs in a limited fashion, but there'd still be, for writers who wanted, particularly the writers who want to give a copy to, you want to give a copy to your 89-year-old mother, for example, who's not going to get on the web. My mother-in-law is in her 80s, and it was a really big step to get her to use email. Now she really likes it because you get the letter much faster, and she still writes like long letters, the kind of letter that you expect to get in the mail using email. But yeah, there are people who simply opt out. As technology gets further and further away from us, I always feel like I'm running behind. I can't check my email. You talked about the creative writers listserv that I do. I forgot to send out a message saying I'm going to be gone, so I haven't been able to update it while I've been out here. And I feel like, oh my God, they're not getting their job postings. They're not getting their contest news. People are going to riot. I feel sometimes we get too dependent on that immediacy. Sometimes we just need to step away. And I tell you this as I'm contemplating getting another cell phone, getting a BlackBerry, and lusting after a new MacBook. I want one of those Air ones. Don't get the Air? Okay, I'll talk to you later about this. You go to the Mac store and it's like, pretty. It's so thin. So I wanted to take some time to answer questions from you about this dilemma, because if you're a writer, you're probably thinking through these issues and trying to make decisions about what's the best venue for your work. Where do you want to see your work? And I haven't even talked about the whole issue, and this is when I wish John and I usually give this talk together because he's really good on the whole issue of copyright. But say you're a writer and you have a blog and you post a poem on your blog. You have in effect published that poem for all the world to see because there's no venue more public than the internet. But say you want to send that poem to me. You want to see it in Crab Orchard Review. You would like some sort of official imprimatur. Is that the way you say that word? I don't know. But you want someone else to say this is good. Someone other than you and maybe your mom. Have you made it impossible to have that poem published? And by that I mean literary journals, whether they reside in the print world, on the web world, or some combination of both, what literary journals usually purchase from writers are first North American serial rights. Here for those of us in the US, that's what we purchase. And what that means is my journal will be the first journal in North America to print your work. Most journals will return the copyright to you afterwards. They print the work, hopefully pay you something for it, and the rights to that work return to you. You agree that you will not send this to some other journal. That's how it should work. But I have seen things that we've accepted for publication then show up on the web. In the window between me saying yes, or Carolyn, who remains our fiction editor, saying yes, I've seen work then crop up on a website. So John is very good about piecing out these differences and talking about the wild frontier at the web and what it means for writers. But really, if you print that poem on your blog, and your blog is one that's accessible to the whole world, I can't purchase first anything rights because the whole world has seen it. So what I'd like to do now, and of course, if something comes up that I don't know the answer to, we can always call him. He was homesick yesterday. He needs to get up. We can always call him. But I want to know how these issues are impacting you as writers. What are you thinking about? It's especially confusing if you're really young and you're making your first forays into publishing anything. It's very confusing. Yes?
Well, it's not really a question, but just, I don't know, maybe to give you something to go off of here.
Mm-hmm.
In my personal experience, you know, like submitting material to all kinds of different journals, I never once have I actually had to submit anything online.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I have been submitting to print journals, so maybe that has something to do with
Right.
it. But I don't, I mean, I know that online is a growing presence, but I don't know if it's as broad as it might seem.
Right. I'm glad to hear you say that because I do wake up with nightmares thinking, oh, no one's reading this actual journal. No one wants to read print anymore. No one knows what print is anymore. So I'm heartened to hear you say that, and that I'm not just an old fuddy-duddy who's set in her ways, who wants to kill trees and has no heart. And certainly you can select that path. There are still plenty of print journals that will read your work and will publish your work. Just in my little region, there's a Crab Orchard Review coming out of SIU. There's Sou'wester, which comes out of SIU Edwardsville, our sister school. There's Big Muddy, which comes out of Southeast Missouri State University. You may notice a pattern here that the real supporters of literature in this country are the university writing programs, the small presses, the university presses. That's really where things are still happening. And I think people who are working in those venues are in it for the long haul, that we are determined to keep Crab Orchard Review going in some form or another, as long as we can, you know, as long as the post office doesn't kill us, or, you know, something like that. So print journals still very much exist. Each print journal, I think, is confronted with the realities of the web, meaning, are we going to have a web presence that's just informational like ours? If you Google Crab Orchard Review, our website will pop up and it'll tell you what theme we're reading for right now. We did the Illinois issue, and right now we're reading for an issue called New and Old, Revisions of the American South. And I'm really interested in regionalism and how it isn't regional anymore. So I've been looking at the addresses of the work we've been getting. And a lot of it is from what we would define as the South. But then I'm getting stuff from California, I'm getting stuff from New York. And then it's interesting, in cover letters, people make arguments for what is and isn't the South. It's like, this is about Maryland. It's one of those states that make you go, where is this? And then, this is about West. It's about West Virginia. It's one of those states that also seems iffy. This is about Missouri. I'm like, no, Missouri is just. Well, my joke to my husband is Missouri is a southern state for black people and a northern state for white people. Oh, I'll never get invited back to Missouri again after saying that. But that's the way it feels like to me. And I'm talking more St. Louis than Kansas City. Kansas City feels like the beginning of the West to me. But I'm very interested as a reader and a writer in regionalism and how regional boundaries divide. And over the years at Crab Orchard, we've done all sorts of thematic issues. We did one about music, the world of music, the music of the world. We did one about stage and screen entertainment, because I'm a bit of an entertainment junkie myself. And we've done these I think we're going to keep doing these regional issues. I've been taking pictures of California while I'm here, and maybe we'll be doing a California issue. That would be really interesting. But this is why I want to keep this going, because I have a strong interest in the literature of this country, being an immigrant to it myself. It's like I had to learn the rules. And one of the ways you learn the rules of any particular place is what people decide to write about and what they embrace in their own writing. I can even see that in my beginning level students. I gave them an assignment to write about the landscape. All these autumn poems came flowing in. It's like, okay, can we think of another word besides autumn? Is there some other word? Fall! So other questions or observations on this sort of wonderfully and vexing time, I think, for literature. Yes?
What is your opinion of the e-readers?
I think they're lovely, and I have lusted in my heart for a Kindle. I haven't bought one yet. My one concern is how poetry looks in that way. I haven't yet bought one, and I think one of the reasons I haven't bought one is it seems fine if I'm going to read Subway and plain books. I'll put it that way. You know, your mass market paperback. It seems terribly wonderful to be able to download, the new Sookie Stackhouse book, which maybe you don't actually want as a physical object. But maybe you want to, read about sleazy Southern vampires and then be able to delete it. I'm actually not sure. I'm actually, but poetry, I'm not sure how I would. I still want to, and I guess you can take your Kindle to bed, but I have this romantic notion of I really am a very lazy person, so I write in bed and I read in bed, and it doesn't seem as sexy to read poetry on a Kindle in bed to me. But I do. It's interesting that you asked that, because I think about that in terms of this list that I do that Anna Leahy described. And when I try very hard to not post things that are exploitive of writers and legitimate contests and calls for submissions that actually result in people getting published or winning the cash that they're supposed to win or getting the check. And I'm always suspicious of something that says that something will be published solely in e-book form. E-books are certainly popular, but I don't see everyone walking around with one. They're popular, but they're not ubiquitous. So I always get a little suspicious, like, you're only going to publish in e-book form, not even a freaking PDF? Well, it seems like it's still a fairly limited audience. And basically I see them, my husband and I are basketball fans, and we go to our colleges, our universities' basketball games, and basically I see the basketball-obsessed husband and the wife who's been dragged along, and she used to bring a book, and now she brings an e-reader. That's what I've seen the most of them. Yes?
Do you think then that the threat that internet-based publication and e-readers pose is more towards the plain and subway literary circle than to poets at large?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's an unfair generalization to say that poets sort of like cleave to literature. Of the groups that there are, I think the poets would be the ones who romanticize the notion of owning books.
Yes.
Who want books.
Yes.
So maybe the internet's sort of like a flash in the pan subject for poetry, because I think even if we do move towards web-based publication, we'll still want or ache for or be nostalgic for bringing the book of those poems to bed with us.
Yes. And this also has ramifications for higher education and who gets hired. Every fall I do a talk for my graduate students, like here's how you put together your CV, and here's how you put together your resume, and why it's important to have both, and blah, 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 and here's your section where you print your publications. And this was the first time where, and I didn't have a ready-made answer for them, but with so many people publishing work in online venues, do you put the whole URL? And my advice was, yeah, put the whole URL there. Don't just put the name of the magazine, put the whole URL and the particular page you were on. Hopefully it will archive you. That the best web journals do end up taking on a heft and weight like a print journal. And the irony is that some web journals end up doing a best of print issue, which creates this two-tier system. You are good enough to be in the original web journal, but you're not good enough to be in the best of. How do you feel then? How do you like that? I feel kind of crappy if that would happen to me. It's like, oh, I was good enough for you to put this up, and now I'm not going to be immortalized in the anthology that you're doing. But this is an issue, too. Hiring committees hire creative writers at universities, and they check references. And if you've published a story or a poem and the website's entirely disappeared, is that poem still published? These are very fraught issues, to my mind. Yes?
Well, just addressing the was it still published, what about like print back issues that are no longer available? I mean, are those still published?
Interesting question, because if you're a pack rat like me, you still have that back issue from 1997, and you can still show it to somebody. It's like, here it is. This magazine may be defunct, but here's the tree that died for it. You know, here it is. I can wave it, and here I am on page 97, and I can photocopy that and put that in my dossier. But if it's a web journal and the journal itself entirely disappears and is basically gone, I don't know. I guess you still have to print it out, but I'm still struggling with these issues myself. That's why I called it dispatches from a poetry editor as opposed to answers from a poetry editor. Bulletins, talking points, things to think about. But I think every writer has to struggle with these issues. If you want an audience, there's no quicker audience than slapping stuff up on Facebook as a note. Oh, yeah. You get instant gratification. But then have you published it? And my argument is, since you select a group of people to be your friends, and this group of people has been pre-selected by you, it's not visible to the entire internet. So for me as an editor, if something was originally a note that someone posted on their Facebook page and only their friends saw it, I would consider that an unpublished poem or an unpublished piece. If someone slaps it up on their blog and I can just Google that person's name and their blog pops up and there's the poem, I don't feel as kindly about it. But these rules are changing every day. And I could totally ignore that. I could say, I don't care if it's been on their blog, and some editors do. It ends up being in the hands of editors a lot. And each of us decides what standards we want to adhere to. As for the legal side of things, that's why I really wish John was here, because he has this mind that can just sort of zip, 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 and explain it to people. But he is so ethical and moral that if you are his Facebook friends, he asks you, please delete if you're going to send to our literary contest. We do the Crab Orchard series in poetry, which has published individual collections of poetry from poets such as Jake Adam York and Leanne Rorapah and Oliver de la Paz, really wonderful poets. But the managing editor, the series editor, is a very upright and moral man, and he's decided that Facebook would taint that social networking would taint that, would give the appearance of an unfair advantage from one poet, one entrant over another. So we ask that people, if they're going to send work, that they unfriend him, and he won't be mad at you. Other questions or thoughts or impressions about this issue? Yes?
Consider publishing the poem has been published but revised, drastically different.
Mm.
The parts of it might have been published.
Now that's definitely an argument for case-by-case basis. I would have to see the original myself and see how far that new version deviated from it, and if it bore no relationship essentially to the earlier version, I would consider it a new poem, or at least make the argument to my other editors that it's a new poem. If it has a new title, but if it feels like a rehashing rather than a re-envisioning, I probably would ask that poet, do they have anything new? Particularly if the way we work is that we have undergraduate and graduate interns that work with us, that work as first readers, but they are not allowed to reject or accept any manuscripts. But I do ask that they read everything that comes in, and our MFA students do that. They read everything that comes in, and I ask them, if you're a poet, read the fiction. If you're a fiction writer, read the poetry. I ask them to read everything. And I get 3 yeses or 3 nos, and I go back and look at it, and if I agree with them, I pass it on to the next stage. If I disagree with them, at that point I send the letter saying, that does not say at this time. And I set aside the work we're seriously considering. And when it comes to picking poetry, John and I sit down and work through the work together. Sometimes we read passages out loud from poems we're considering. And if I'd gotten word, or if the poet explained in the cover letter, this poem was previously published in a different form, I would probably lean, if I'm interested in the whole packet, I would probably lean toward a different poem, just because I would want something that didn't have any history. Part of my pleasure in being an editor is bringing something that hasn't been seen before in any form whatsoever, making that available to people. So I'd probably lean, if the person was upfront about it and said in the cover letter, this poem substantially different, blah, 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 I would probably see if I could see it, if I could find it. Now, the question is, if the person doesn't say anything about it, I might not know. It would depend on what venue. If it was on the web and I Googled the person's name and I found the poem, I would probably lean towards saying no. If there wasn't another poem, usually when we move things on to that other stage where John and I are looking at things, usually there's 2 or 3 poems in a packet that I'm attracted to. So I may choose not to run the one that has a history, but to choose the one that's brand new. So, because I do want to emphasize that what literary journals do whether they're print or web or whatever combination people end up with, is bring work that has merit but is new to people. And I love having the privilege of introducing people's new work. And we could argue back and forth whether what you're describing is truly 100% new. Maybe it's 75.234% new. Who knows? But I would probably, in that situation, lean towards going with something else from that writer. Or I have several levels of rejection letters. There's our basic rejection letter, and it's still a letter, and it has several paragraphs. The first paragraph is the no paragraph. The second paragraph is the what we're doing right now at Crab Orchard Review, so you know when to send paragraph. And then the third paragraph is thank you again for sharing your work with us. That's a short paragraph. When things have made it through several of these cuts that I'm describing, the letter changes, and I specifically, we use FileMaker, so I can alter the letter, and what I used to scribble on the end of a page, I can now put as a PS that's typed that said, this poem came really close for us, we'd like to see more of your work. I can tailor my letter for particular circumstances like the one you describe. So I'm not entirely a Luddite. In fact, I really love the capacity to shape the letter in different ways than I couldn't before. Yes?
You mentioned how a trend emerging in the last while is grad students writing shorter and shorter fiction.
Mm-hmm.
If they have an online magazine or publication.
In mind, yeah.
And the suggestion, which I think I agree with, is that the new form, if we consider it a new form, is come into being because of the new media.
Mm-hmm.
And so the venue shapes the literature being written. Magazines do that to poetry.
Right.
And have done that for a long time.
Yes.
If you want to write a magazine poem.
20 lines or less, yes.
Yeah, it fit on a page or a page and a half or something like that. And like you say, you might get 8 poems submitted and you might like 3
Mm-hmm.
or 2. And, I'm sure one of the difficulties you sometimes have is when you've got a sequence of poems that you like, and it sort of seems like each poem seems part of the larger
Mm-hmm.
whole, and they're not working as individual pieces or
Mm-hmm.
magazine poems. So, I'm curious how often that happens.
That happens,
Often you write
yeah.
a letter saying, I love your work, but
Mhm.
it doesn't, it's not magazine
Yeah.
ready.
Well, here's the irony. I've noticed that fiction writers tend to be, because of the new media, writing things that are shorter and shorter, microfictions, 100-word stories, stories as tweets. I really don't get that one, but I've seen it. Whereas poets seem to be going in the opposite direction, that I'm receiving longer and longer individual poems and sequences and things that are interrelated. The novel in verse has been a trend. But let me hold on and finish the answer here. I tend to publish poems that, even though they may be quite a part of a sequence, that individually they still stand on their own and still make sense both as part of that sequence and as an individual poem. And we have in the past run, rather than one longish poem, if a poet is working on a project that has several poems that are on a related topic. Like in a recent issue, we published several poems by a poet, and her name is out of my head right now, but she was working on a series, and this is probably the book she's working on, but we saw a series from the vantage point of a Chinese botanist, Lu Gimgong. And we were so intrigued by these poems that we ran several of them, and they were interconnected, but they also stood alone. So I love these projects, I love that people are doing them, but I still want to publish individual poems that if the poem is taken out of the sequence, it'll still make sense. There. I got it. Yes.
So if you're
Mm-hmm.
Do you see yourself as a part of that trend because of the obvious, like, serious unity that's in My Father's Kite?
I do, and I didn't think I was going to be one of those poets who did one of those books that everything, here's my sequence, and then I had to go make it a sonnet sequence. Ew. I didn't think I was going to do that, and that may be part of the reason we were talking in class earlier about I wrote the book and put it away for a long, long time and didn't come back to it until recently. And that may be part of the reason, because I didn't want to be part of a trend. It's like, ew, another book all on the same topic where all the poems are about the same thing. And, ooh. Yeah, it turns out it actually was a very good thing, because those books, as small as the poetry audience is, those books tend to be the books that people remember, the books that people will tell their non-poetry reading friends to read. Like earlier in her career, Kim Adenicio, who is a pretty established name now, did a book called Jimmy and Rita. And it was about a couple, Jimmy and Rita. And I could get people to read this book who wouldn't have read her earlier books that were just sort of, here's my poem on this and here's my poem on that. It's like, oh, if you can describe what your book's about, it's like, oh, here's this couple that drinks a lot and gets into fights. It's like, oh, really? People write poems about that? Any other questions? I hope I haven't left you too vexed with these issues.
In order to not leave them too vexed, why don't you give them one tidbit of advice?
In terms of submitting your work, and this sounds like a really stupid thing for me to say, but whether you're submitting your work, whatever venue it is, make sure your name is consistent. I know this sounds strange, but we have gotten submissions from people and their name is, say, James L. Blank in one spot, and then on the poems itself it'll say Jim Blank, and then at the end of the cover letter it'll just say James Blank, and then somewhere else Jimmy Blank. It's like, make up your mind what your writer name's going to be. It may be different from your actual name. I'm not saying that you necessarily have to have a pen name, but when you're submitting your work, it's like applying for a job, and you have to be consistent. So when you're with that job interviewer, you can't say, call me Jim, or James, or Nicholas. But we have seen this time and time again, and it really is a quandary when we're about to accept work. It's like, well, what name do we print this under? If you haven't made up your mind, we can't make it up for you. So just be consistent in all ways of submitting your work. Thank you.
Allison is happy to sign books for a few minutes here, and otherwise we'll see hopefully most of you at the reading at 5.
Mm-hmm.